Hello, good afternoon. Jesus. 2 weeks ago, when I finished work, I would come out of work and it was daytime. Even it feels like last week I would come out of work and it was daytime. Today I come out of work, or this week I come out of work, it's nighttime. I hate this winter fucking thing of shorter days. I don't like it. Like, I'm realizing I've been recording my podcasts in the dark now for a few weeks, because I do them Saturday after work, not in the middle of the day, and so it is dark. So I have this horror film setup. I have my notes. I have my timer, or do I? Yes, I do. I have my timer. First note is on curating your reality. Now, there's a guy who talks about curating your reality a lot. I mentioned that previously. What does it mean? I've been thinking about this idea for a while. I've always been obsessed with the idea of curating your reality. And I'm realizing that, well, obviously it's a natural instinct to want to do that. But growing up in the time that I'm growing up, apps and subscriptions, it feels like every other week there's a new app, a new subscription. You know, I remember when Uber became a thing, Deliveroo, so many things, Amazon. So you have all these subscription-based things, not specifically Uber and Deliveroo, although you can subscribe to those things. But Amazon, YouTube, Netflix, all these things. And for example, with Netflix, you know, I remember when Netflix was a thing that people would laugh at, you know, there was only bad films on it. But now Netflix is, a lot of people, that's where they watch films at home. They pay monthly and they watch whatever's on Netflix. As a result, Netflix is curating their entertainment habits, their movie watching habits. A lot of people don't go to the cinema, so they only watch what's on Netflix. So they only have access to what's on Netflix. Now, Netflix doesn't just take every movie about everything, right? They even make their own movies. And so in a way, Netflix is curating a lot of people's realities, because everyone's talking about the latest Netflix documentary they've seen. There's a bunch of interesting things. But the point is, for example, my father watches a lot of shows on Netflix. He has Netflix, so he watches stuff on Netflix. So when my brother and I say, have you seen this show, that show that's on Amazon or that's on Hulu? He says, no, because I only watch what's on Netflix. And as a result, that's a way in which people's realities are being curated through what they watch. If you don't venture outside of Netflix, you're only seeing things that Netflix approves of. So you're letting this corporation essentially curate your reality in a way. And now through Netflix, the algorithm will curate your movie watching habits by picking what you seem to like, etc. And so you're watching things that you're more comfortable with for the most part, right? Because you're watching, it is, what's the word? Recommending things that are similar to things you've seen before. So I had thought about curating reality as it pertains to, for example, what you eat, the people you hang out with, all these things. All of these things matter a lot. If you're being lazy with these things, you're being lazy with how you're curating your reality, and therefore you're being lazy with how you're perceiving the world and experiencing your life. So, for example, I don't just watch stuff on Netflix. In terms of food, I have a very specific diet. In terms of people, I don't really have many friends at all. Another thing that occurred to me was music. The idea that music has a very powerful impact on our lives, especially if you're someone like me who's always wearing the headphones or listening to music with the speakers, basically always listening to music. You're listening to people. Music with lyrics is people telling you things they believe for the most part. And it's not innocuous at all. If you're listening to a lot of sad music, that impacts your mood. I'm pretty sure that's proven scientifically that if you're listening to sad music, it makes you sad. Happy music makes you happy. If you're like me and your playlist goes from, Sun is Shining by Bob Marley to Black Sabbath, War Pigs, to Eminem, Mockingbird, to, it goes all over the place, from very sad to very happy to violent to all these things. I'm sure that has an impact. Now, on one hand, I am influencing my playlist, which shows that I am a very chaotic person, right? My playlist is chaotic, therefore that suggests that I am chaotic. Well, then through listening to that chaotic playlist, I am reinforcing my own chaoticness, if that makes sense. So if I curate my playlist, for example, to be less chaotic, that would, in a way, shape me to be less chaotic, I believe. Right? It's like a chicken and the eggs situation, except you have control. And I was thinking about, there's many branches to that idea, but when I'm at work, we have a lot of couples, and I love asking those people, especially when we have people who come here for anniversaries. You have these old couples, and they tell you, oh, it's been 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And I love asking them, how did you manage? How did you make it that far? And one thing that occurred to me, since through the past year specifically, even the past 6 months, I have been learning so much about human behavior in terms of, I realized how naive I am, how complex people are. I remember after I broke up with my girlfriend, I moved into the apartment next door with a bunch of housemates, and people always, I've been told many times that I have an intimidating energy. I'm tall, I have long hair, I have a resting bitch face. I'm very insular. I get that from my grandma. Gets the same feedback. She has this energy about her that she doesn't let people in easily. And so me being a man, being tall, has amplified that to a degree, right? So people usually don't approach me, and they do get this first impression of me being quite cold and intimidating, right? And so I moved into this apartment. After breaking up with my girlfriend, I cut my hair, I shaved everything. I looked like a monk. And I was talking to this girl who was my housemate, and she was hitting on me. And to this day, I have very little relationship experience, sexual experience, and her hitting on me, I felt very intimidated, because I could sense that she was the opposite. She had a lot of sexual experience. She was older than me. And so and I had never been hit on in that way, where you have this older woman who's very confident. It feels like she wanted to eat me up, like actually eat me. I was very intimidated by that situation, right? Which is quite pathetic to say, but trust me, I was very intimidated. And we were talking, and at some point she said, appearances can be deceiving. No, appearances are deceiving. And, in that situation, from the outside, it might have looked like this short, women are naturally shorter than men for the most part, right? So she was a regular size. She wasn't tall or anything. And she was flirting. We were flirting together. We were flirting together. She was very attractive. But me, I was extremely uncomfortable and scared, really. Like I was interacting with a bear that could just tear my head off at any time, because of her sexual energy and her confidence was so strong, and mine wasn't. And so I said, I'm pretty sure she said first that appearances can be deceiving, and I said the opposite. And since that day, I've always been telling myself that appearances are deceits. This idea that people are never what they appear to be. And this idea has been reinforced in me so many times, and yet I always fall into the pitfall. I always take appearances. I always judge a book by its cover. I still do it. I don't have the foresight and the ability to step back and look at a person and think, okay, that's how they look. there's much more to them. They might look like, for example, a very attractive woman, and immediately that's that's attractive, and you think vulnerable and all these things, and that means nothing. Same with people. They might look nice, charismatic. That means nothing. Because naturally, when you see a woman who's attractive, as a man, you feel like you have a leg up in the sense of, as a man, you're physically stronger. She's the one who's... There's this line from Swingers with Vince Vaughn, I love, where this guy is scared to approach a woman, and his friend tells him, no, you're a big bear, and she's a little rabbit. She's a tiny little rabbit. She's scared, It is known, right? We all know that men are physically stronger. We have this advantage. And so these ideas and these stereotypes, which are based in truth, make us feel like appearances matter more than they do. So in that situation with that beautiful young woman, I was definitely the tiny little rabbit who was scared, and she was the big bear who was approaching me. And just in the past few weeks, I've been reminded once again of this idea that appearances are deceit. We had this guy come to work, this new colleague, and he was very charismatic. He talked a lot to everyone. He was, what's the word? He was just interacting with everyone, asking them about their life every day. Very nice guy on the surface. And in just a few weeks, his arc has been just all over the place. And it seems, apparently, what I've heard is that he was lying about a lot of his life, who he was. And there were many layers to him that just were peeled back very quickly to show that the surface him was not reflective of what's underneath, right? And so what I've learned is that a lot of people who have this negativity under the surface, they learn to hide it with extreme levels of positivity on the surface. They become very charismatic. They're good at convincing you, at making you become their friend, at making you feel like they care about you, things like that. Pretty sure that connected into something. So, talking to people who have been in relationships for a while, once again, coming from me, who's never seen a truly functioning, beautiful relationship like in the movies that last, and they lived happily ever after. I've never seen that firsthand. And I feel like, to a degree, it's because when you see a real relationship, you see the good and the bad. And maybe I'm a bit of a pessimist. And I feel like it leans more towards bad than good from my experience. But I asked these people, how have you managed? And my thinking is, if they've done it for so long, clearly it's a good functioning relationship, right? On the surface, they've been together for 10 years. Surely they're happy. And one thing I'm realizing is that I can't judge whether their relationship is a good one, as in there's more positive than negative, based on that interaction. I can't judge based on the fact that they look happy currently in this luxurious restaurant having a wonderful meal, right? It's easy to appear happy in that situation. I can't judge based on the fact that they've been together for 10, 15, 20 years. People stay in loveless, toxic relationships for a really long time. It doesn't mean shit. And so what I'm realizing is that I'm taking advice from people without knowing whether their advice is valid or useful. Which brings me to the point that I still have no clue how a relationship is supposed to work, what a good relationship is. I don't know. And I don't know how to... I guess experience will be the teacher on this front. I'm pretty sure last week was Ngannou against Fury. I had given my prediction. So now's my feedback on the fight. My legs were shaking during the fight because it looked like Ngannou was doing quite well. It seems like 90% of the world, including boxing experts and fans, say that Ngannou won the fight. I watched the highlights afterwards, and it feels like they were quite biased towards Ngannou, showing his successes more than Fury's successes. When I watched the fight, it seemed to me that Fury was winning based on volume. I'll have to watch the whole fight again, but I think Fury still won based on volume. But everyone seems to say that Ngannou won. Now, this fight, Fury against Ngannou, is very similar to Ngannou's first title fight against Miocic, where Ngannou started learning fighting very recently. I think he was 25. And so when he fought Miocic for the belt, he was essentially a baby in the sport. Very little experience in all the different disciplines. He's a freak of nature with great punching power, but he was very inexperienced. He was a baby in the sport, and he fought the best guy in the world at that time, and he lost. People like to say that Ngannou gasses out. He has never lost a fight based on his gas tank, ever. He lost the Miocic fight because he didn't have the experience and the knowledge to hurt Miocic. He was getting beat up, but he didn't get finished. So it's not a case of his gas tank running out and then he got beat up. He couldn't touch Miocic. He couldn't stop the takedowns. So the gas tank isn't an issue. Same thing with the Fury fight. First ever boxing fight against the best in the world. So he doesn't have the experience. He looked a bit tired in the last 2 rounds. He should have done more. He could have won, I think, if he had been more aggressive in those last 2 rounds. But I think he lost. And I think some people seem to think that's his best. He won't do better as a boxer than he did there. And I think the complete opposite. I think it's the same as the first Miocic fight. This was baby Ngannou fighting the best in the world. In the next fight, he'll be exponentially better because he won't be a baby anymore. So I do seriously think he has a chance to beat a lot of the top 10 and beat Fury in a rematch. So that's my boxing segment. There's a show called The Foundation, or just Foundation. It's pretty good. Second season is much better than the first. And in that show, one of the main characters is the Emperor of the Universe, Cleon. And what happened is that this guy called Cleon decided that he would create a genetic dynasty, I believe they call it. He clones himself, implants his memories into the clone, so that essentially he gets to rule forever. Now, he does and he doesn't, because the real him dies. So, as far as the universe is concerned, it's the same person because they have the same memories. As far as he's concerned, he's died. But what you get is 3 versions of him ruling at the same time. Now, the version in the middle, 40 years old or something, essentially in the prime of his life, is the ruler. And the other 2 versions, the older version of him is an advisor, and the younger version of him is there to learn, to become the ruler. So you have the 18-year-old version, which kind of embodies this youthful teenage version of him, the one that wants to learn, the more adventurous one that takes risks, and that's a sponge for knowledge. Then you have the old version who's been through it. So he has the hindsight and the experience to help both younger versions. And then you have the middle version who's in between. He's not as experienced as the older guy, but he's more youthful. He's got more strength. So he's in charge. And he's there he doesn't really use the younger version to help him. So he's more there to help the younger version become him. And this goes on for something like that. There are 18, somewhere around 20 versions of this Cleon that rule consecutively. And I thought about this in terms of, so recently I watched a lot of Tai Lopez videos I mentioned last week, and he talks about how we are much more similar to our parents than we've been led to believe, and that who we are is much more determined by our genes and what we inherit from our parents. So the point he was making, I thought about it a lot, this idea that when you think about nature versus nurture, he leans more towards nature. So I thought about it in terms of, I thought about foundation, and this idea that what if I am basically my father? I am my father. It's an exaggeration, but I think it's useful to go towards the extremes. What if I am exactly my father, right? I'm the same person. The only reason I am different is because of the circumstances. I was born in different circumstances, right? Now, I talked about it with my brother, who immediately resists the idea because it's scary. I don't want to become my father. I have a lot of ambitions and goals and dreams, great things, and my father hasn't, achieved great things in his life besides creating some beautiful children and, some art he's created. But it's natural to resist the idea because you don't want to become your parents. Even if your parents are extremely successful and you don't want to be them, you want to be you. But I think it's a useful way of looking at things. I looked at my father in comparison to his father and how similar they are. And this idea that the only way they differ is because my father was born in 1980, so in a different environment, which affected him, and his father was born like around 30 years earlier. So once again, what if they are exactly the same person in terms of essentially who they are is the same, but they were born in a different environment, so they adapted to that environment. That's the only way they're different. So when I look at my father and his father, they are very similar, right? They are very similar persons. And I am similar to my father. Now, my father and his father, their circumstances were different, but nowhere near as different as my circumstances and theirs. The world that I was brought up in is much more different than theirs, and I am different. But I think it's useful to think of what are some commonalities between my dad and his dad. There are some things where they're very similar. And so I think naturally these things must be in me as well. And then I thought about foundation and this idea that perhaps, I don't know if it's the author's goal when what's his name? Vladimir Asimov, something like that. Asimov wrote Foundation. But what if the idea is that I am essentially a clone of my dad, and by communicating with him, by having this completely open dialogue with him, I'm able to talk to myself, to an older version of myself, right? Once again, this is an exaggeration of the idea, but what if I decide to look at it exactly in the same way that these clones are living? What if I decide to talk to my dad and his dad in a way to question my future selves, right? What if I was able to question my 40-year-old, what is he? He's going to turn 46, I think. 40, or he's born in 80. What? No, my mother was born in 1980. He's born in 76. So he's going to turn 47 this year. Tomorrow. Yeah, he's going to turn 47 tomorrow. So what if I look at it in terms of, here is my 47-year-old version of me. Wouldn't that be amazing to be able to communicate with him? Now, it's not the same as in a sci-fi, for example, where, for example, my 47 years old version of me, who's currently living in 2046, comes back from the future and talks to me, right? That's a movie plot we've seen many times, where that version of me obviously would be exactly me with the same circumstances. So that would be extremely useful. But my father is me with different circumstances. So he can talk to me about things that are kind of buried deep within of himself. He can't talk about how he's reacted to the life I've had because he's different. Once again, going back to the idea of this Cleon dynasty where you have the father, the grandfather, and the son, and they can communicate openly because they understand they are the same person. What if I have this approach and I talk to my dad with the goal to get to know myself better? So this made me think about how the dialogue I have with my dad is not very profound at all. We talk about surface level things. And it doesn't matter how true this theory is and these ideas, this Tai Lopez idea that you are essentially much more similar to your parents than you think, and this foundation movie or story idea that I can look at myself as a clone of my parents. But it's useful in the sense that it made me realize how my relationship with my father is extremely important. And I need to take steps to breaking the ice. We are too much like strangers. We don't have this open dialogue between each other. And I think if there's one person in the world that I should be able to talk to about anything, it's my parents, but especially my father, since he's a man and I am a man. And based on what I know of his relationship with his father, that wasn't the case necessarily between them, this open dialogue. Now I know when I have a son, I'll put the theory into practice and I'll make sure there's an open dialogue between each other where we can talk about anything so that I can help him, right? But in terms of the present, it's made me think that I need to take some steps towards making sure that my father and me have this completely open dialogue, that we cannot be strangers. We should be the opposite. He should know me. And obviously your parents know you better than even you know. But my father and I, there's been so much distance between us, even physically, since we moved to the UK 12 years ago and he stayed in France, in Paris. So I think that at the top of my list of priorities, reconnecting with my father should be one. Just making him understand that I want to be able to talk to him about anything, about my deepest secrets and vice versa. Because if he shares things with me, that might teach me about myself and vice versa. So to boil it to a single point, I think that from now on, I'm going to go with that idea that I am a clone of my dad in a different circumstance. Therefore, I need to get into his brain and really understand what he's learned about himself through his experiences and see how that might apply to me and how that might be useful to me. Because I'm much closer with my mother, for example. And my mother is my parent. I have a lot of my mother in me, but she's a woman. And that changes everything. As much as we are similar on many things, I feel like that has been emphasized in me my whole life. Oh, I'm like my mother. I know I'm like my mother in so many ways. And we have a very open dialogue. But I feel like because I'm so close to my mother and because we understand we're so similar and because we have this open dialogue between each other and we talk about anything, or almost anything, I have been made to feel like that's enough. And I have completely neglected my relationship with my dad. I've also had a more open relationship with my stepdad, David. And on one hand, that's very positive. But on the other, once again, going back to that theory, he is not an older version of me. He's someone else. He's different. We are similar in some ways. But I'm not I'm not a continuation of him. physically, I am a continuation of my father. I was a cell, a bunch of cells in his body, right? I am literally an extension of him. So once again, I'm just realizing that I need to make some efforts to put that into practice and make sure we are not strangers to each other. I think that's a huge problem in the black community in America, that kids growing up without their father, mostly. I know that's a huge problem, and I think statistically that's being put down as one of the main issues plaguing the black community in the US that doesn't get talked about enough. Now, obviously, there are many reasons why that is, but growing up without a father is an extremely problematic thing for a young man. And that's not my case, but I'm realizing I need to do more to create that connection. And then last week, I wanted to talk about Game of Thrones. Fuck, my timer. I forgot to start my timer. I need to stick to my 46 to 52 time limits. What does it say? Okay. Game of Thrones. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Game of Thrones is the best show of all time. Until they kill Jon Snow. After that, it's a mess. Even though you have some exciting episodes after that, as a series, it just crumbles. And I remember waiting every week for the episode. And what I remember most is how I felt following that show. One of my lecturers in university is called Mark Jenkins. He's a filmmaker. And I watched an interview that he did for the BFI, probably. He interviewed Robert Eggers, who made The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman. I think The Lighthouse was the best movie that came out that year, 2021 maybe, 2022, not sure. And by far his best film. And they're conversing, and then Mark Jenkins talks about how they are considered to be filmmakers who focus on mood more so than story. Almost like it's a form of criticism they receive. I remember Robert Eggers, when he was becoming more prominent after The Witch, people saying, oh, this guy's all about atmosphere and mood rather than story. What does that mean? And Mark Jenkins gives his idea of what that means. He mentions that when you have a dream, you wake up in the morning and you start to talk about what happened in the dream, right? And how it made you feel. And it doesn't really make sense. When you talk about the plot of the dream, nothing makes sense. It's stupid, right? It doesn't make any sense. But you remember how you felt. So you can't make people feel how you felt based on what happened, based on telling them what happened, but you can recall a feeling of it. And he talks about how a movie is the same. And I thought that was such a powerful idea. This idea that a movie is like a dream. And when the movie is finished, what matters most is how you felt watching the movie. You won't be able to recall the plot exactly. And if you think about the plot, it won't make you feel the way you felt watching the film. But when you are watching the film, it's working on all these different senses on levels you can't even comprehend. And then when the film is over, you're left with an impression, just like a dream. I went to see The Killer last week, David Fincher's latest film, and I watched it, and it finished, and I thought, I've seen versions of that movie before. We've all seen that. It's a very, it's tried and done. But the film has stuck to my mind. So why has it stuck to my mind? Well, you have a guy in David Fincher who's an expert filmmaker. He's a top tier expert in his field, right? So you have to think, why did he make a film in that genre that we've seen so many times? He made his version of the film. The plot which I've seen many times before, didn't affect me when I was watching the film. I thought, okay, cool, I've seen that before. But it left an impression on me. I really want to see it again. And the films I love the most are films which leave an impression on me. A lot of the time, it's films that I see once, and when the film finishes, I think, it wasn't that interesting. But then the day before, and the days after, and the weeks after, I think, I have to see the film again. Because the film left an impression on me. And unlike a dream, I can go back and see it again and appreciate it more. So, and that's something that's lacking in movies. I've mentioned that before, this idea that movies nowadays are just repetitions of the previous movie. Is that they don't focus, they don't even understand. In most films, the people making them don't understand this idea that if you do it a certain way, if you create your own language, like David Fincher does, right? David Fincher has his language. He's a very idiosyncratic filmmaker. The camera movement is very precise. I've seen, I think, Nerdwriter break down the camera movement. Everything is done on purpose for a purpose. In his case, it's really the most extreme version of that, where the camera will move perfectly in sync with the actors, right? And so once again, I watch The Killer and I think, okay, it's the David Fincher version of this film I've seen many times before. And when watching it, I didn't understand how significant that was. And then I think about it, and the way it made me feel is unique to David Fincher. Only an expert of his level could do that. And I think, you think about The Lighthouse by Robert Eggers, The Killer by David Fincher, these films have a very specific language. They have their own language. In the case of The Lighthouse, it's shot in 1.19 by 1, I think. Or is it 1.12? It's almost a square. Now, a square aspect ratio doesn't work. It's shit. Let me check something. There's no way The Killer is shot in 2 by 1, is it? That would be very sad. Two aspect ratios should never be used. They never work. Okay, no. Yeah, good. I saw the trailer for Shogun recently. The TV show coming out, I think in February or March next year, on Samurais, finally. It's in 2 by 1. Okay, 2 by 1 and 1 by 1 are just, no, just don't do that. What's his name? Xavier Dolan shot Mummy on 1 by 1. It just feels wrong. It's horrible. It's disgusting. And 2 by 1 is equally disgusting. Don't use those aspect ratios. But you have The Lighthouse shot by Robert Eggers on film with this, I don't remember the name, but they put a filter on it to create this more gritty look. It affects, it's complicated, but it's very specific the way it's shot. This aspect ratio, which you've probably never seen a movie in that aspect ratio, shot in black and white. And the movement, the language, the way the camera moves is very specific. And so you're left with this impression. Because the guy making it is doing such a specific thing, right? It leaves an impression. With David Fincher, he shoots in CinemaScope. I'm not sure exactly how, but he adds lens flares, but he doesn't shoot anamorphic. Now, this is very nerdy information. For example, Shogun is shot on anamorphic, but they crop it to 2 by 1. Fucking, that's wrong on every level. But David Fincher, who used to shoot on anamorphic, doesn't anymore because the lenses are too quirky and they make life more complicated. But he likes the lens flares and the aspect ratio. So he crops the footage in post, which I think is weird. I don't like it. In fact, visually, I thought the movie made me quite uneasy in the same way the 1 by 1 aspect ratio and the 2 by 1 aspect ratio make me uneasy. Because he shoots on the red. I don't like the way the red looks. People might say, oh, it's just a capturing device, your camera. No, that's not true. It might be 99% true in terms of you can get the results you want on almost any camera nowadays. The Creator was shot on a Sony FX3 £4,000 camera with probably a very expensive set of lenses, anamorphic lenses. But I don't like the way the red footage looks. The Arri Alexa is the best you can get in digital, I think. And I was very confused because the highlights are blown out. Now the red has probably around dynamic range of 15. Complicated stuff. If you shoot a sunset on your iPhone, what you'll find is that either you can see the sky in detail and the sun, tiny little sun, but then the landscape on the bottom is all black, right? Or the opposite. You see the landscape very clearly, but then the sky is all white. There's no information. That's dynamic range. Dynamic range is the number one thing you want in your camera to get beautiful cinematic footage. You won't be able to get a beautiful sunset on your iPhone. Well, you will, but there's going to be part of the image that's going to be in complete darkness because the iPhone doesn't have the dynamic range to capture the brightest area and the darkest area. Now, I talked about this in terms of the Lord of the Rings series, where they have blown out skies. You shoot with a very expensive camera that has a very good dynamic... What the fuck is it called? Dynamic ratio? No. Dynamic range, because the range allows you to keep everything in the frame clear and focused. But in the Killer, they blow out the highlights all the time. Now the reason you'll pick film over digital is because when you blow out the highlights on film, assuming you know how to color grade the footage, they will look beautiful. The roll off is beautiful, it looks amazing. If you blow out the highlights on digital, it looks disgusting. Now, people like Roger Deakins, who shoots on the Arri Alexa, has a beautiful grade on the footage, and he's able to create this very nice highlight roll off, and it looks good. It still doesn't look as good as film, sorry. But in The Killer, it looks like they went for this obvious digital look. There's blown out skies, blown out highlights everywhere. The color of the highlights is this kind of digital, ugly white. It's horrible. So I saw it in cinema, and I thought maybe they calibrated the projector wrong. So I looked at the trailer on my laptop, and it turns out that's just how it looks. I don't understand it. I think it's horrible. But then again, the film has left an impression on me, so probably, fuck. Oh, my camera died. Why? I didn't fucking plug the fucking charger in. Oh well. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and take care.